Hello, and welcome to the analog posterize effect. I'm Varis, your host for this Photoshop tutorial. I'm going to be looking at a technique for recreating a printing effect popular in the psychedelic 60s. The posterize effect was used frequently for rock concert posters. We're going to update this look for the 21st century and beyond. The traditional effect was created by producing several high contrast negatives at different densities and printing with different inks. I'll show you how to simulate the high contrast look, blend different high contrast layers, and colorize the result with the original colors. I'll show you different variations that could be had easily, and I'll end with a unique psychedelic effect that features an unusual combination of old filters. We'll start with this image and arrive at a classic posterized look. I'd like to point out that this is different than simply running a posterize adjustment, which would give us this. The technique I'll show you is much more flexible and controllable. You can maintain a normal color and even add back some tone in the highlights, or make the color anything you like. Finally, I'll show you how to create this unique psychedelic effect. Along the way, we will be learning about the threshold adjustment, layers and layer masks, advanced blending options, a smart object layer, the Gaussian blur and find edges filters, gradient maps, and the different supply mode. Okay, are you ready to have some fun? Let's begin. Okay, so here we are. This is our starting image, and I'm going to create a high contrast negative effect, litho effect. So for that, I'm going to use the threshold adjustment layer here, and we'll start here. And the threshold adjustment creates a black and white effect, high contrast, like a codolith type of negative effect. And the slider here determines where the split is going to occur between black and white. So if we move to the left here, more and more the image turns white. And as we move to the right, more and the more the image turns black. So we're going to find an area here that is just for the deepest shadows. And I will accept that. And now what I need to do is create a number of different separations of this image, different densities, as if I was creating different codolith negatives. So I need to create another threshold effect. So I'm going to go ahead here and click on another threshold layer. The problem here is that no matter what I do now, nothing is going to change the way the image looks because it's already been contrasted with a threshold adjustment. So there's a little trick here. I need to create a threshold adjustment that reaches down below the previous adjustment to the background layer. And the way we can do that is using advanced blending options. So I'm going to get to that from our layer options flyaway menu here. Go down to blending options, and we're going to get this the layer style dialog. But what we're really looking at is this area here, advanced blending. And the thing to pay attention to here is the knockout. By selecting deep instead of none, we're causing the adjustment to reach down to the bottom layer and run the calculation on that and bring it up to the current layer. So now I can select kind of I'll get a little bit more of the image to be black here, and the next trick for recreating this effect is to change the opacity here. So instead of a full black, I'm going to try for a kind of a medium gray. Okay, so now I have a dark black and a medium gray, and I'm revealing a little more detail in the image. Okay, let's do one more. So I'll select the threshold adjustment again, And again, I need to get to that blending options dialog, and here's a shortcut to do that. I'm going to double click in the empty area here in the layer thumbnail, and by double clicking I go right to the layer style dialog and advanced blending. We'll go ahead and select deep again. And this time I'm going to show a little more. I'm going to get a little more tone in the image, maybe to about there. And we'll reduce our opacity again. This time I want something that's a little bit lighter so that I've got a black, a medium gray, and a light gray. And that's looking like the effect that I'm looking for. Okay, so here's our original. And here's our posterize. Now I'd like to get the color back into this image, so I'm going to do this one little trick here. I'm going to duplicate the background. And this background copy I'm going to drag to the top. And this is going to be the basis for our color. So I'm going to change the apply mode from normal to color. So this apply mode says take the color from this layer and apply it to the luminosity of the underlying layer. So you can see what I've done is essentially added back the color from the original to the tonality that I've created with these 3 threshold adjustment layers. And the cool thing is I can come back down here and readjust any of these threshold adjustment layers to get the effect that I'm looking for. So perhaps I can add a little more shadow here, just to create just a little more contrast in that image. And all right. So now what I'd like to do is actually get this white break in the skin. I'd like to get a little more tone back in that. And I'm going to use one more trick here. I'm going to duplicate this background one more time. And this one is the basis for our color. So I'll label it as such. And this one I want to use for putting the tone back in the face and the arm. So I'm just going to put face here. I'm going to change the mode back to normal. And we'll reduce the opacity quite a bit. I'm actually looking for just enough opacity to get some tone in the highlights in the face. But I don't want to reduce the contrast that I have in the rest of the image here. So what I'm going to do is use a layer mask to isolate this particular layer to just the face and this arm here. So what I want to do now is hide this layer with a layer mask. And the shortcut to doing that is to hold down the Option or Alt key and click on the layer mask icon here, and I will get a black layer mask. So I've hidden the layer completely, and now I want to paint in with white into the black layer mask wherever the face appears, and that's where I want this to show through. So I'm going to paint back and sort of soften the contrast there and add a little more tone into the face. In fact, I can adjust the opacity of that to adjust the effect. Maybe bring back a little more of the face. And I still have the contrast in the rest of the figure. Okay, so that's pretty good. We're making a very interesting effect here. But we're not done. We can create some other variations. So I can change the color of this image. Right now we have a naturalistic color even though we have a posterized image. Let's change the color, and the way to do that would be to use a gradient map. So I'm going to go down here at the bottom of the layers panel and we're going to create a special type of adjustment layer. I'll hold down and I'll select now gradient map. Gradient map is an interesting adjustment that allows us to replace the colors of the image with a gradient. So right now I have a gradient that's based on the foreground and background colors, but I can edit the gradient here simply by clicking in this gradient bar, and I get now the gradient editor. So we can see here is the foreground to background color. It happens to be sort of a dull blue to a lighter blue color. Foreground to transparent, black to white. Certainly if I click to that, you can see I get a black and white rendition of the image. But I can pick any of these gradients, and let's pick this one here, and you can see it totally replaces the colors or the tonalities in the image with the colors in this gradient, from this color representing black to that color representing white. And we can edit this gradient. Let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to move the blue over here a little bit, and I'll put in an additional color stop here. So if I click once, I get another color stop, and I can edit the color by clicking on this patch here. I'll select black, and you can see now I've put in some contrast back into the image. So I'm going from black through blue, red, and orange, and I have a very interesting image. Let's edit that blue color. So I select it so that it's sort of highlighted. You can see the little black rectangle on top. That means that that stop is selected. And let's make this a bit lighter blue, and maybe a little less saturated blue. Okay. And now we can play around with where this blue occurs in the gradient. I'm going to move these color stops over. And let's move this yellow one over, get a little more yellow into the image, and I'll put a white color stop here. So I'll click, edit the color to white, and now I've got the white background back. Okay, so you can see how by moving these little colors around, I can alter the look of the image. Right here is a 50% transition point. So you can see the midpoint here between the blue color and the red color. I can actually drag that around and show more or less blue. And it alters the look of the image. Okay, so if I want to use this gradient again, I can save it. I'll give it a new name. Here we'll call this Rainbow 2. And I click on New, and the new gradient shows up right there. So there's a lot of variations possible with this. I don't necessarily have to use it at 100%. I can use it at a lower opacity and blend it in with the underlying layers. I can use it in hue mode. So I'll change the apply mode to hue, and that has a different effect. As you can see, it's applying the color but preserving the saturation and the luminosity from the underlying layers. I can replace the color entirely, which is pretty similar to normal. I can use just the saturation from this gradient layer onto the normal colors of the original, and I get a completely different look. Okay, so I'm going to just return it to here, and in fact, we'll leave this off for now, and I will reselect the image here as the top layer, because now I'm going to create an entirely different effect. I want to merge the result of all of these layers into a layer right above this selected layer. And I need to do that so I can run some filters on it, and we will create our psychedelic effect. So in order to merge the result of all these layers into another layer, I'm going to use a little trick here. Hold down the Option or Alt key, and then select from the Layer Options flyaway here, I'll select Merge Visible. And that gives me a merged result of all of these layers at the top here. And so nothing has really changed. But this layer, I'm going to run a filter on it. But before I do that, I'm going to change this layer to a smart object. So I select from Layer, Smart Objects, Convert to Smart Object. And the reason I'm doing that is that I'm going to run two different filters on this, and I want to preserve my options, my editability, so that once I've run the filter, I can return to where I left off and continue editing it. And the only way I can do that is by changing this into a smart object. So I'm going to rename this to Effect. And now let's run some filters on it. First filter I'm going to run is a Gaussian Blur filter. So I'll select Blur, Gaussian Blur. And right now I'm looking for a blur that's pretty wide and really just sort of obliterates the image pretty much. I just gets these big blurry blobs, and we'll say OK. And you can see here it's a smart object, so any filter I run on it is a smart filter, and I can turn off the filter effects and get right back to the image the way it was before I ran the filter. So we'll add the filter back now, and then we're going to add one more filter. And this one is going to be an interesting one. It's the Find Edges filter. So I go Filter, Stylize, Find Edges. And right now it looks like not very much has happened, but in fact I have created an effect here. I just have to make it more visible. So we're going to make an adjustment here. I'll make a curves adjustment, and what I'm going to do is hold down the Option key when I create this new curves adjustment layer, the Option or Alt key, and that way I get well, I guess it didn't happen that way. Here's the curve, but I need to group this curve with this effect. The effect layer, I want the curve to be applied to it before the effect layer is applied to the rest of the image. And the way to do that is to group it, create a clipping mask. So I'm going to hold down the Option or Alt key and click in between the curve layer, the curve adjustment layer, and this effect layer. And now this curve is grouped to the effect layer. Now I want to contrast up the curve. So as you can see, by radically increasing the contrast of the curve, I'm revealing this sort of moire line work that is the effect of the Find Edges filter. That's this Find Edges filter. If I take that off, I've got a contrast effect on just a simple blur. If I take off the Gaussian blur, I've got a contrast effect on a Find Edges filter that's applied over the regular image. So you can see how the smart filters work. I can undo or refine these filters at will here. But what I'm looking for is to use this odd line pattern to alter the image underneath it. So I'm going to go back and select the effect layer, not the adjustment which is being applied to the effect layer, but I'm selecting the effect layer, and I'm going to change the apply mode from normal to difference. Difference is going to invert the underlying layer by the values, the pixel values in this particular layer. And so now we've got this interesting sort of psychedelic effect, and I'm going to alter it now, how it's applied over the image with a layer mask. So I'm going to create a layer mask here by clicking on the layer mask icon. And I will paint with black to remove the effect. I'm going to remove it out of the figure pretty much. And we'll confine it just to the outside edges. Okay, so there's my effect. It's adding this sort of interesting psychedelic effect around the outside here. And that's the complete effect. I've preserved all of the editability. I can come back in here and re-edit the Gaussian blur effect here by just double clicking on that Gaussian blur filter here in the smart filters. And I'll get a little dialog here that says the smart filter stack on top of this filter will not preview while this filter is being edited. So that's fine. You'll see what that means in a minute here. I'll say OK. And now I can change the radius of the filter and get a completely different look out of this. Okay, so or I can come back in here and re-edit that again, make it maybe even a little broader. Okay, so I've got that kind of effect going on. I can change the curve because this is a smart object. Anything I do now I can re-edit. So if I re-enter the curve dialog, I'm sort of back right where I left off, and I can change how the curve looks, and that's going to change how the psychedelic effect looks. So you've preserved complete editability. I can even come back in here and change one of the threshold adjustments to change the look of this thing. Okay, so there's a lot of different concepts in here that can be applied in a lot of different ways. I hope you've enjoyed this. So thank you. You can find many more video and PDF tutorials on my website, www.varis.com, as well as my blog at blog.varis.com, where I also write about digital photography and Photoshop. Please sign up for my email list so I can give you special freebies and tell you about my seminars and workshops. Also, look for my books on Amazon. Thank you again for watching.